The sound of the door creaking open echoed through the quiet house. Karen, a mother in her late 30s, stood frozen in the doorway of her daughter Emma's bedroom, staring at the piece of paper lying on the desk. The sight before her felt like a punch to the stomach. It was a letter. A letter Emma had written, and Karen had never seen before. Her heart raced as she picked it up. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the creased paper, revealing words that hit her like a wave crashing against rocks. She read the first few lines and her face drained of color. It wasn't just a letter. It was a confession that made everything Karen thought she knew about her daughter seem like a lie. But before Karen could read any further, a sharp sound broke the silence. Her phone rang, the noise piercing the heavy air of the room. It was her husband, Mark. "Karen, where are you?" "Something's wrong with Emma." Her breath caught in her throat. What was happening? Why would Mark say that? Emma, her daughter, she couldn't be. She forced herself to stay calm, but the panic was growing, tightening around her chest like a vise. She stood still for a moment, staring at the letter in her hand. Was this some kind of cruel joke? No, it couldn't be. The words on the page were clear, raw, and full of fear. Her fingers shook as she folded the letter back, and with a sense of dread, she hurried to her husband. As she raced down the stairs and out the front door, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. What was going on? Was Emma in danger? Was this letter a warning? But Karen couldn't focus on anything except the message she had just read. What had Emma been hiding? The pieces of her daughter's life that Karen never even knew about. Could it be the key to understanding everything that had gone wrong? When Karen reached the car, she opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. Mark, his face pale and his eyes wide, was already there, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He didn't look at her. He just started the car and pulled away from the house, speeding down the street. "Mark, what happened to Emma?" Karen's voice cracked. She couldn't hold it in any longer. He swallowed hard, his hands shaking on the wheel. "I don't know. I went upstairs to check on her, and she wasn't in her room. But then I found something. Something that—" He trailed off, his voice barely a whisper. "Mark, what? What did you find?" He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. Her room. There was something wrong with it. It was like she had been gone for a while, but nothing was missing. No signs of struggle. Just a letter. He paused, and the letter said something about— Karen's heart dropped to her stomach. The letter. Emma's secret letter. Before she could speak, Mark's voice cut through the silence. "Karen, I don't understand. What's going on? Why would Emma write something like that?" Her mind was racing. The words on the letter were still fresh in her mind. "I'm sorry, Mom. I don't want you to know this, but I have to tell you. I can't live with this secret anymore. Please don't be angry." But the rest of the letter blurred in her memory. What had Emma been hiding? What was the secret? The drive felt endless. The town streets passed by in a blur, but Karen couldn't stop her thoughts from spiraling. She had always known Emma had her struggles. The teenager had been distant lately, withdrawn from her parents. But this was something she never could have imagined. Finally, they arrived at the hospital. Karen didn't wait for Mark to park the car. She bolted out of the seat and rushed inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The sterile smell of the emergency room hit her immediately, and she was met by a nurse at the front desk. "Is she here? My daughter, Emma?" Karen demanded, her voice shaking. The nurse looked up at her, a hesitant expression crossing her face. "Are you Mrs. Cooper? You need to come with me." Karen didn't ask any more questions as she followed the nurse down the hallway. She barely heard the muffled sounds of beeping machines and hushed voices. All she could think about was the letter and what might have happened to Emma. The nurse stopped in front of a door and gestured for Karen to go inside. Mark was already there, standing with his hands in his pockets, looking lost. Karen stepped into the room. There, lying on the bed, was Emma. Her daughter's face was pale, her eyes closed, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. The sound of a heart monitor beeped softly, but it didn't bring any comfort. Emma looked like she was just sleeping. But Karen knew. She could feel it in her bones. Something was terribly wrong. She rushed at Emma's side, gently taking her hand. It was cold, and for a moment, Karen felt like her entire world was falling apart. "Emma, sweetheart," Karen whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Please wake up. Please." But there was no response. The beeping of the heart monitor grew softer, slower. Karen's pulse quickened as she desperately tried to rouse her daughter. "Is she?" Karen choked on the words, unable to finish the sentence. She didn't want to say it out loud, she couldn't. The nurse standing by the door hesitated before speaking. "She's been unconscious for several hours. We don't know what caused it yet, but we're doing everything we can." Karen felt a wave of nausea wash over her. What happened to Emma? Why was she like this? And what was the secret in that letter? With her heart pounding, Karen turned back to the bed. There had to be an answer. There had to be something she could do. And then, in that moment, the heart monitor flatlined. The high-pitched sound cut through the room, shattering the silence. "No!" Karen screamed, her voice breaking as she clutched Emma's hand tighter. "Please, no." Mark ran to her side, grabbing her shoulders. "Karen, we need to stay calm. We need to let the doctors handle this." But Karen couldn't listen. She couldn't think of anything except the fact that her daughter was slipping away, and she had no idea why. The letter, what was in that letter? It had to hold the answers, didn't it? She needed to know. She needed to find out the truth. And with that thought racing through her mind, Karen turned and ran out of the room, desperate to get back home. The letter was waiting for her. The answer had to be there. What had Emma been hiding? Karen slammed the front door behind her, the sound echoing through the empty house. Her mind was a whirlwind. She could still hear the sharp beeping of the heart monitor, the hollow silence that followed. It was as if her world had split into two parts, before the hospital and after. Everything had happened so fast. Just hours ago, Emma had been her usual self, quiet, a little moody, but nothing that screamed danger. And now, her daughter was lying unconscious in a hospital bed, and Karen was left with nothing but an unopened letter and an overwhelming sense of dread. She rushed up the stairs to Emma's room. The letter was still sitting on the desk, right where Karen had left it. It felt like a lifeline, something that might explain all of this, but she was afraid to read it. What if there was something that would destroy the little hope she had left? She took a deep breath and sat at the desk, folding the letter open once more. Her eyes scanned the words, heart pounding in her chest. "I'm sorry, Mom. I don't want you to know this, but I have to tell you. I can't live with this secret anymore. Please don't be angry, but I'm scared. You won't understand, and I promise it's not your fault. It's mine. I'm not strong enough to fight this anymore. I don't know what to do, and I think I've made the worst mistake of my life." Karen's stomach churned. What was this about? Was Emma talking about something personal? Had something happened to her that she was too ashamed to tell Karen? Her fingers tightened around the paper as she read on. "I know I should have told you earlier, but I was afraid you'd hate me. I don't think I can fix it now. It's too late. Maybe you'll never look at me the same way again. But I want you to know that I love you." Karen's breath caught in her throat. What had Emma done? What secret was she hiding? She read the rest of the letter, but it made less sense with each word. It was a jumble of fear, guilt, and confusion. Emma spoke of feeling trapped, of not knowing who to turn to, and of thinking that there was no way out. It was clear that something had happened, something serious. But Emma hadn't said what it was, not directly. She had only hinted at it, as if afraid to put it into words. The last line of the letter stood out like a warning. "I'm sorry, Mom. Please don't be mad. You have to forgive me, even if you can't understand. I've made a choice, and now I have to live with it." Karen felt a wave of panic sweep over her. What was Emma talking about? A choice? What kind of choice could her daughter have made that was so terrible that led to her being in the hospital? Her hands shook as she folded the letter back up. She had to go back to the hospital, but something in her gut told her that the letter wasn't the answer. It was only the beginning. Whatever Emma was going through, it wasn't just a teenage phase. It was something deeper, something darker. Before she could think any more, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Mark. "Karen, you need to come back. The doctors say they need to talk to us." Her heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They're not sure yet, but there's something they think you need to know." Karen didn't need to hear more. She grabbed her keys and rushed out the door, her mind racing with every possibility. She had to get back to Emma. She had to find out the truth. The hospital was quieter now. It felt like a cold, impersonal place, filled with sterile white walls and the distant hum of machines. Mark was standing by the entrance, waiting for her. His face was pale and his eyes looked hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days. "What did they say?" Karen asked as she approached him. Mark shook his head, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "I don't know. But there's something off, Karen. The doctors aren't saying much, but they think Emma's condition might not be from an accident or an illness. They think it's something else." Karen's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Mark looked around, making sure no one was listening before lowering his voice. "They said it could be a reaction to something she took." Karen's blood ran cold. "Something she took." She repeated, barely able to comprehend what he was saying. "Are you saying drugs?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He just looked at her with wide eyes. It was clear he was just as shocked as she was, but the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. It made sense, in a horrifying way. Emma had always kept to herself more in recent months, spending hours in her room. But drugs? Emma had always been so careful, so cautious, so afraid of getting caught. She couldn't have, could she? "Karen," Mark said softly, "there's something else. The doctors found something strange. They think it might not just be drugs. They think it could be poisoning." Karen's legs almost gave way beneath her. "Poisoning?" She stumbled back, grabbing onto the nearest wall for support. "Poisoning. But who would do that to Emma?" "I don't know," Mark said, his voice shaking. "But the doctors are saying it's possible that someone gave it to her, someone she trusted." Karen's breath caught in her throat. She thought back to the letter. The fear in Emma's words, the sense of guilt and regret. Had someone convinced her that this was the only way out? Had someone pushed her to make that choice? Her mind raced. Who could have done this? Who could have harmed her daughter? "I need to know what happened," Karen said, her voice firm, despite the panic swirling inside her. "We need to figure out who did this, Mark. We need to find out what Emma was mixed up in." "We will," Mark said, his voice grim. "But first, we need to find out what's really going on. The doctors said we should talk to the police." The word hit Karen like a slap in the face. Police? How was she supposed to even start processing all this? But before she could ask any more questions, a nurse appeared at the end of the hallway, looking both urgent and solemn. "Mrs. Cooper," she said, her tone serious. "There's something you need to see." Karen exchanged a glance with Mark, then followed the nurse down a narrow corridor. The hospital felt even colder here, as if it were keeping its secrets. The nurse stopped in front of a small room and gestured for Karen to enter. Inside, a doctor stood by a computer screen, a grim expression on his face. The moment Karen walked in, he turned to face her. "We've reviewed the results," he said, his voice low. "And there's something you should know. We found traces of something in Emma's system, something that doesn't belong. But it's not what we expected." Karen's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean?" The doctor hesitated, then said, "We believe Emma was poisoned, but not by any common substance. This is something unusual." Karen's eyes widened. "Unusual?" "Yes," the doctor said. "It's a rare substance, one that's not easily accessible. We're still running tests, but if it's what we think it is, it's not something someone could just accidentally get their hands on." Mark's face went pale. "Are you saying someone did this on purpose?" The doctor nodded. "We believe so." Karen felt as though the ground had just shifted beneath her. This wasn't just a health scare. It was something much darker. And in that moment, Karen realized that the letter wasn't just a confession. It was a clue. A clue that could help her find out who had poisoned her daughter and why. But the more she thought about it, the more questions she had. Who would do this to Emma? And how could she have been so blind to whatever was happening in her daughter's life? As the doctor walked out of the room, Karen turned to Mark. We need to get to the bottom of this. We need to find out who did this to her, and fast. But just as she finished speaking, her phone buzzed again. The number was unfamiliar, but Karen felt a chill run down her spine when she saw the message. I know what happened to Emma. I can help you, but you have to trust me. Her fingers froze over the screen. Who was this? And how did they know? The words on Karen's phone screen glowed back at her, flickering like a warning. I know what happened to Emma. I can help you, but you have to trust me. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the message. It wasn't from anyone she recognized. No name, no details, just that cryptic sentence. Who is it? Mark asked, his voice tight with concern as he stood next to her. Karen blinked, her mind racing. I don't know, it's from an unknown number. She hesitated, not sure what to do next. Part of her wanted to just ignore the message, to pretend it was a prank or some kind of mistake. But deep down she knew she couldn't. Not now. Not when Emma's life was on the line, and everything was slipping further out of control. I'm calling them, Karen said, her voice steady despite the panic gnawing at her insides. Mark grabbed her arm before she could press the button. Karen, be careful. You don't know who this is. What if it's someone trying to mess with you? She looked at him, his face full of worry. She could see his point. He was right to be cautious. But Karen couldn't shake the feeling that this message was important, that it might be the key to understanding everything. I have to know, she whispered. I need answers. We need answers. With a deep breath, Karen pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a voice picked up on the other end, low and gravelly. Hello. Karen's heart raced. Who is this? How do you know what happened to my daughter? The voice on the other end paused for a moment before responding. I'm not your enemy. I'm trying to help. But you need to trust me, Mrs. Cooper. Karen's throat tightened. How do you know what happened to Emma? What do you mean by help? The voice sighed, almost as if it were preparing to say something difficult. I know what your daughter has been involved in. I know what she's been hiding. You don't understand yet, but if you want to save her, you'll listen. Karen felt a knot form in her stomach. What do you mean, save her? She's in the hospital. She's. I know, the voice cut in. And I'm the only one who can tell you why. But you have to meet me. There's too much at stake for us to talk about this over the phone. The urgency in the voice was enough to make Karen's pulse race. She looked over at Mark, whose face was filled with suspicion and fear. Mark, I need to meet them, Karen said, her voice shaky but determined. No, Karen. This doesn't feel right, Mark insisted. We don't know who this is. It could be a trap. I don't have a choice, Mark, Karen said quietly, her eyes focused on the phone. We don't know what happened to Emma, but whoever this is might have the answers. And if I don't go, I'll never forgive myself. Mark's face softened, but he still looked unsure. I don't like this, but if you feel you have to go, I'll come with you. Karen nodded, relief flooding her. At least she wouldn't be alone in this. Where do we meet? She asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The voice on the other end of the line gave an address, a quiet park on the outskirts of town. It seemed strange, almost too quiet. But there was no time to question it now. Come alone, the voice instructed. And bring your husband if you trust him. Karen ended the call, her hands shaking as she turned to Mark. We need to go. Now. Mark didn't say anything, but his eyes were full of questions. He clearly didn't trust this person, but he knew they had no choice but to follow through. The drive to the park felt longer than it should have. The streets outside were empty, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Karen's mind was racing. Who could this person be? How did they know so much about Emma? The park was deserted when they arrived. Only the distant sound of birds could be heard, and the trees loomed dark and still in the evening light. Karen's breath came faster, her heart pounding as she scanned the area. There were no other cars in sight, no people. Only the eerie emptiness of the place. "Do you see anyone?" Mark asked, looking out the window, his hand hovering near the door handle. "No," Karen said, her voice tight with fear. "But we were told to meet here. They said they'd be here." They sat in the car for a few moments, not sure what to do. The air seemed to thicken with tension, and every passing second felt like an eternity. Then, just as Karen was about to suggest they leave, she saw a figure emerge from the shadows near the far end of the park. A man, tall and wearing a dark hoodie, his face partially obscured by the hood. "Stay here," Mark said, his voice firm as he reached for the door handle. "No," Karen replied quickly. "We don't know who this is. I'm going to talk to him." "Karen, no." Mark shot her a worried glance, but she had already opened the door. "I have to," she said quietly. "I have to know what's going on." The man's eyes met hers as she walked toward him, his expression unreadable. As she got closer, she could feel the tension in the air, like something was about to snap. "You're Mrs. Cooper," the man said in a low voice. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Karen replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need to know what happened to my daughter." The man's eyes shifted toward Mark, who was still sitting in the car, watching from a distance. "Is he coming too?" Karen nodded. "He's my husband." The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned and began walking toward the edge of the park, motioning for her to follow. "Wait," Karen said, taking a step forward. "Who are you? How do you know what happened to Emma?" The man stopped and turned, his face now fully visible beneath the hood. He was older than Karen expected, maybe in his 40s, with sharp features and cold eyes. He didn't seem dangerous, but there was something unsettling about him, as if he knew things he shouldn't. "I know what Emma's been involved in," he said flatly. "I know she made a choice, and I know who pushed her to make it." Karen's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, pushed her?" The man paused, his eyes narrowing as he glanced back toward the car. "I can't say too much here, but if you want answers, you'll have to trust me." Karen didn't know if she could trust him. Every instinct told her to turn and run, to take Mark and leave this strange, dangerous encounter behind. But she couldn't. Not when Emma was still out there, fighting for her life. "Why should I trust you?" Karen asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more urgent. "Because Emma's life is in danger, and I'm the only one who can help you save her." A chill ran down Karen's spine. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes locking with Mark's. His face was tense, filled with worry, but he was already stepping out of the car, walking toward her. "You need to listen to him, Karen," Mark said softly, his voice shaking. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than we thought." Karen hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her mind spinning. "Okay," she said finally. "We'll follow you." The man gave a brief nod before turning and leading them further into the darkness of the park. But as they walked deeper into the shadows, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking right into the heart of something far more dangerous than they had imagined. And as the night closed in around them, she couldn't help but wonder, was Emma's secret really worth all this? The air felt unnaturally cold as Karen, Mark, and the mysterious man walked deeper into the park. The trees above them cast long, eerie shadows, and the distant hum of city life seemed to fade into the background. Karen's heart pounded as she tried to keep her pace steady. She didn't like this place. It felt wrong, like they were being led into a trap. But at the same time, she had no choice but to follow. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. The man didn't look back as he led them through the winding paths of the park. He moved with a purpose, his footsteps quick and confident. Karen wanted to ask him 100 questions. Who he was, how he knew Emma, why he was helping them. But she stayed silent. Mark, too, walked beside her, his eyes scanning their surroundings with a mixture of caution and concern. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a secluded clearing. The area was completely isolated, surrounded by thick trees that blocked out most of the light. In the center of the clearing stood a small, dilapidated shed, its door slightly ajar. It looked abandoned, out of place in the otherwise peaceful park. The man stopped in front of the shed and turned to face them. "This is where we need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious. Karen's pulse quickened. She was tempted to turn around to run back to the safety of the car, but something held her in place. She glanced at Mark, who gave her a quick, unsure nod, silently signaling his agreement to continue. "Let's go inside," the man said, pushing the door open with a creak that seemed to echo through the trees. Reluctantly, Karen stepped forward, followed closely by Mark. The inside of the shed was dim, with only a faint light filtering in from the cracks in the wooden walls. The man motioned for them to sit on a pair of old chairs near a dusty table. Karen's heart raced. She had no idea what she was walking into, but it was clear that whatever it was far bigger than she could have imagined. "Who are you?" Karen finally asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. "How do you know about Emma?" The man looked at her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. "My name is Thomas. I'm someone who has been keeping an eye on your daughter for a while now. You can say I'm a friend." "A friend?" Karen repeated the word, tasting strange in her mouth. What kind of friend watches a teenager without their parents knowing? Thomas exhaled sharply. "It's not what you think. Emma was involved in something dangerous, and I was trying to help her without involving you or anyone else." "Dangerous?" Mark asked, his voice tight. "What exactly are you talking about? What was Emma involved in?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly weighing his words. "Emma got tangled up with a group of people who, well, let's just say they don't have the best interests of others at heart. She got involved in something that she couldn't get out of. But she was trying to get away. That's why I stepped in." Karen's mind was spinning. "A group of people? What kind of people? And why didn't you tell us? We could have helped her." "I couldn't," Thomas replied, his voice low. "If I told you, it would have made things worse. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The people Emma was involved with are dangerous. They're not just ordinary criminals, they're organized. And they don't hesitate to hurt people who get in their way." Karen's stomach churned. What does this have to do with her being poisoned? Thomas looked at the floor for a moment, his face troubled. "The substance in her system, it's a drug. But it's not like any drug you've ever heard of. It's something new, something the group has been using to control people. It makes them dependent, makes them easy to manipulate. They use it to keep their recruits in line. And if someone tries to back out, they make sure they pay for it." Karen felt her heart stop. "Are you saying Emma was a part of this group?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes, she didn't want to be, but she got pulled in. She got too close to someone in the group, a person who convinced her she had no other option. And that's how she ended up in the hospital." Mark's face darkened, his fists clenching in his lap. "So this person, this friend, did this to her? Poisoned her?" "I don't know," Thomas said. "But I think she was drugged because she was trying to get away. She was planning to leave the group, and they didn't like that." Karen's mind raced. Everything was falling into place, but the pieces were too fragmented. Her daughter, Emma, had been involved in something far beyond what Karen had ever imagined. And now she was paying the price for it. "But who did this to her?" Karen asked, her voice cracking. "Who are they? We need to know so we can help her." Thomas hesitated again, his eyes darkening. "I don't know exactly who did it, but I can tell you who's behind all of this." Karen leaned forward, hanging on his every word. "His name is Caleb," Thomas said, his voice low. "He's the one who brought Emma into the group, and he's the one who controls everything. He's ruthless, manipulative, and he'll stop at nothing to keep his operation running." Karen's breath caught in her throat. Caleb, the name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. "How do you know all of this? Why were you watching Emma?" "I was trying to protect her," Thomas replied, his voice quieter now. When I found out she was in trouble, I started keeping an eye on her. She didn't know I was doing it, but I wanted to make sure she didn't get hurt. I didn't think it would go this far. But now I don't know if I can help her." "Why not?" Mark asked, his voice sharp. "You know who's behind this. You know what happened to Emma. What are you waiting for?" Thomas's face grew darker. "Because Caleb doesn't just operate in this town. He's got connections everywhere. He's dangerous. And if I move too quickly, he'll know. He'll come after Emma again. And next time, he might not leave her alive." The weight of his words hit Karen like a ton of bricks. Emma's life was still in danger. And the person who had hurt her was still out there, watching, waiting. "What do we do?" Karen whispered. "How can we stop him?" Thomas stood up, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but I've been trying to track Caleb down. He's hiding, he's careful. But I think he's made a mistake. I've got an address, a place where he's been hiding out. But it's risky. If we go after him, we might walk right into a trap." Karen stood up, her legs shaking. "I don't care about the risk. I need to save my daughter. I'll do whatever it takes." Mark looked at her, his face conflicted. "Are you sure? We don't know if we can trust him." Karen didn't hesitate. "I don't care about trusting him. We need to stop Caleb before it's too late." Thomas nodded, a grim look on his face. "Then we don't have much time. I'll take you to the place, but you have to be ready. We're walking into the lion's den." As Karen, Mark, and Thomas made their way out of the shed, the weight of their decision hung heavily in the air. There was no turning back now. They were about to confront the person who had destroyed Emma's life, and they weren't sure if they'd make it out alive. But Karen didn't care. All that mattered was saving her daughter. The drive to Caleb's hideout felt suffocating. Karen's mind raced, her thoughts spinning with all the questions she still didn't have answers to. The dim streetlights outside flickered past the windows, casting brief flashes of light on the faces inside the car. Mark was driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He hadn't said much since they left the park, but Karen could feel the tension in his body, the same worry that knotted in her chest. Thomas sat in the back seat, staring out the window, his silence adding to the heavy atmosphere. Karen glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but he was hard to read. His face was set in a grim expression, and the energy around him felt almost cold. "How far is it?" Mark finally asked, his voice breaking the silence. Thomas glanced at him, his eyes sharp. "Not far, just a few more miles." Karen swallowed hard. She was so close to answers, so close to the truth. But she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to get much worse before it got better. The more she thought about Emma, the more terrified she became. How had this happened? How had her daughter gotten wrapped up in something so dangerous? And now, how could they stop it? The car rolled to a stop at an intersection, and for the briefest moment, everything outside seemed still. Too still. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked again, his voice quieter now. Thomas nodded, but there was no certainty in his gaze. "This is the best lead we have. Caleb's been hiding out in a warehouse just outside of town. We have to act quickly, or he'll disappear again." Karen clenched her fists in her lap. "What's the plan once we get there? We can't just charge in blindly." Thomas hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the dashboard. "We wait until dark, then we make our move. The place is surrounded by a few security cameras, but I know where they're weak. We'll be in and out before they even know we're there." Mark glanced at Karen. She could see the hesitation in his eyes, the fear of what might happen once they arrived. But they couldn't stop now. They had to find Emma. They had to stop Caleb. As they neared the outskirts of town, the streets grew emptier. The buildings became more spread out, and the soft glow of streetlights gave way to the harsh industrial lighting that illuminated the area near the warehouse. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, with cracked windows and peeling paint on the walls. It was exactly the kind of place Caleb would hide in, isolated, easy to defend, and difficult for anyone to find. Mark slowed the car, pulling into a nearby alley that led to the back of the warehouse. They parked a short distance away, the sound of the engine shutting off suddenly too loud in the quiet night. Karen's heart pounded as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "What now?" she whispered, looking to Thomas. "Stay close," he instructed. "We'll approach from the back. Keep quiet, move fast, and stay low. If Caleb's here, he'll have people watching." They all nodded, and with a shared look, they'd stepped out of the car. The air was cold against Karen's skin as they walked cautiously toward the back of the warehouse. The night was so still. The only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the distant hum of machines from nearby factories. The sky above was dark, heavy clouds hanging low, as if the weather itself was holding its breath. Thomas led the way, his movements swift and calculated. Karen followed closely behind him, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She couldn't believe they were here, so close to Caleb, so close to the answers she'd been searching for. But with every step, the weight of the situation pressed down harder on her chest. This wasn't just about Emma anymore. This was about taking down the person who had orchestrated everything. They reached the back door of the warehouse, which was slightly ajar. Thomas pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the otherwise silent night. Karen winced, but Thomas gave her a warning glance, motioning for her to stay quiet. They slipped inside, the darkness inside the warehouse swallowing them whole. The space was enormous. Large metal shelves lined the walls, filled with crates and boxes. The faint smell of dust and oil lingered in the air, and the only light came from the small windows high up near the ceiling. The floor was covered in grime, and the distant sound of machinery echoed through the cavernous space. Thomas motioned for them to crouch down. They moved silently, staying close to the walls and ducking behind crates whenever they heard a noise. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as they moved deeper into the warehouse. They had no idea what they would find, but every instinct told her they were getting closer to something dangerous. After what felt like an eternity of creeping through the shadows, they reached a narrow hallway that led toward the back of the building. Thomas held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. He pointed to a small door at the far end of the hallway, the only sign of activity in the otherwise dark warehouse. "Caleb's office is through there," Thomas whispered. "That's where we'll find him." Karen's stomach twisted. This was it. They were about to confront the man who had ruined her daughter's life. The man who had poisoned Emma, who had dragged her into his web of manipulation and control. Karen could hardly breathe. Her thoughts were a chaotic swirl of fear, anger, and desperation. "I'm going in," Thomas said, his voice low but determined. "You stay here out of sight. I'll handle it." Karen shook her head. "No, we're in this together." Thomas looked at her for a long moment before nodding, though the tension in his face remained. They approached the door carefully, and Thomas slowly twisted the handle. The door creaked open just enough for them to slip inside, and what they saw made Karen's blood run cold. The room was dimly lit, with large desks covered in papers, computers, and files. But it was the figure standing at the far side of the room that froze Karen's breath in her throat. Caleb. He was standing with his back to them, staring out of a window. His dark, shaggy hair and sharp features were unmistakable. But what sent a chill through Karen's spine wasn't just his appearance. It was the fact that he was holding something in his hand. A syringe. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Karen's with an unsettling calm. His lips curled into a cold smile, as if he had been expecting them all along. Well, Caleb said, his voice smooth but laced with danger. "I wondered when you'd show up." Karen took a step forward, her anger flaring. "You're the one who did this to her," she hissed. "You're the reason Emma's in the hospital." Caleb's smile only grew wider. "Your daughter made a choice, Mrs. Cooper. She knew the risks. But now it's your turn to face them." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them with a loud bang. Karen whirled around to find two more men standing in the doorway, blocking their only escape. Caleb's eyes gleamed with amusement. "You should have stayed away. But now you're all mine." The room seemed to close in on her, and for the first time since they'd entered the warehouse, Karen felt a true sense of dread. Karen's heart hammered in her chest, her pulse pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at Caleb, his dark eyes glinting with malicious amusement. The two men behind them blocked the exit, their faces cold and expressionless. There was no way out now. Mark was beside her, his body tense, ready to act at any moment. Thomas had already shifted into a more defensive posture, his eyes darting between Caleb and the two men at the door. But none of them moved. Not yet. Caleb's grin widened as he slowly lowered the syringe from his hand, resting it on the desk. "You know, Mrs. Cooper, you're much braver than most," he said, his voice calm but laced with something cold and calculated. Most parents would have stayed in their comfortable little lives, oblivious to what their children are doing. But you decided to dig. You decided to find out too much. Karen's fingers clenched into fists. "You're the one who dragged my daughter into this mess, Caleb. You poisoned her. You manipulated her." Caleb chuckled darkly, stepping closer. "I didn't drag her into anything. Emma made her own choices. She wanted a way out of her life, her boring little world. I just showed her the path." He took a step closer to Karen, his voice dropping. "And in the end, I gave her exactly what she wanted. Power. Freedom. A chance to be something more than just another teenager stuck in a suburban life." Karen took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "And you killed her for it. You almost killed my daughter." His smile faltered for a second, and Karen could see the faintest flicker of anger flash across his face. But it was gone almost instantly, replaced by a cold indifference. "She didn't die, did she? She's still breathing, still alive. That means she still has a choice. And if she hadn't been so weak, she would have joined us. But now, well, I'm afraid it's a little too late for that." "Don't talk about my daughter like that," Mark snapped, stepping forward to stand protectively beside Karen. His fists were clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with anger. Caleb glanced at Mark, sizing him up before turning his attention back to Karen. "It doesn't matter now. The point is, she made her choice. And now you're here in my world. You've been warned." "Warned?" Thomas cut in, his voice low and filled with warning. "You think you've won, Caleb. This isn't over. We're not walking out of here empty-handed. If you think you can get away with this, you're making a huge mistake." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "You're still trying to play the hero, Thomas." His tone was almost amused, as if Thomas were a child playing a game. "You should have stayed out of this. It's bigger than you." "I'm not playing games," Thomas replied sharply. "I'm here to stop you. And I will stop you." Karen's head was spinning. Every word Caleb spoke sent a jolt of fury through her, but it also added to the terror clawing at her insides. She had never imagined her life would come to this, standing face to face with the man who had ruined her daughter's life. The man who had orchestrated everything, manipulated Emma into his twisted world. Caleb's laugh was cold, echoing in the small room. "Stop me? I've built an empire, Karen. An empire that stretches far beyond your little town. You think you can just come in here and shut it down? No one can stop me. No one." For a brief, heart-stopping moment, Karen believed him. His confidence was chilling. He had no fear in his eyes, no hesitation. He was in control, and it was clear he didn't think anyone could challenge that. But she couldn't back down. She couldn't let him win. Not when Emma was still out there, fighting for her life. Not when Caleb was the one responsible. "You're wrong," Karen said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I don't care how big your empire is, Caleb. I'll do whatever it takes to stop you." Mark looked at her, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. He wasn't sure how this would end, but he knew they had no other choice. If they wanted to save Emma, they had to stop Caleb here and now. Thomas, meanwhile, was watching Caleb carefully, as though calculating his next move. He didn't seem afraid, but Karen could tell he was assessing every angle. He had been in situations like this before, and now it was clear that they were going to need all the help they could get out of here alive. Caleb took a step back, his hands casually resting on the edge of the desk. "I admire your determination, but you're making a mistake, all of you." His eyes swept over them again, his gaze cold and calculating. "You can't defeat me. You've already lost. Before Karen could respond, one of the men at the door moved. The other stepped forward as well, drawing something from his waistband. Karen's heart dropped. He was pulling a gun. The man with the gun leveled it at Karen. Mark reacted instantly, stepping in front of her, his hands raised as though trying to block the weapon with his own body. "Don't do this," Mark warned, his voice low and steady. "Move aside," the man barked, his finger twitching near the trigger. "This doesn't have to get ugly." But Caleb's voice rang out, sharp and cutting through the tension. "Hold on." The man with the gun hesitated, his brow furrowing as he looked back at Caleb. "Let's not escalate things just yet," Caleb said, his tone unexpectedly calm. "They're not the threat. She is." Karen's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" Caleb's lips curled into a wicked smile. "I've been waiting for this moment. You've all been so eager to come here and fight me. But you haven't realized what's really at stake. You're not just up against me, Karen. You're up against what I've created." "What have you created?" Karen demanded, her voice hoarse. "Emma wasn't the only one to join me," Caleb said, his gaze narrowing as he looked at Karen with a dark intensity. "There are others like her, people who believed in what I offered. And I'm not just going to let you walk away from here. We won't let you walk away." Karen's pulse quickened. "You've brainwashed them," she hissed, the words like acid in her mouth. "That's what this is about. You've turned Emma into one of your puppets." Caleb's smile only deepened. "It's not brainwashing, Mrs. Cooper. It's freedom. I gave her freedom. And now she's one of us. She chose to be here. She chose to join us, and she chose to be strong." The words hit Karen like a slap. She was shaking now, but it wasn't just with fear. It was anger, pure and white-hot. She had been fighting this whole time to save Emma, to pull her out of whatever trap Caleb had set. But now it was clear. Emma had made a choice that had led her straight into Caleb's hands. "What does she want?" Karen asked, her voice low and hoarse. Caleb stepped closer to her, his gaze never leaving hers. "You'll see soon enough. But first, you need to understand this. Emma isn't the weak little girl you think she is. She's stronger than you could ever imagine, and you're going to learn that the hard way." Before Karen could say another word, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway behind them. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted in the dim light. It was Emma. She stood there, her eyes dark and unreadable, her expression void of emotion. Karen's heart skipped a beat as she looked at her daughter, but someone who felt like a stranger now. "Emma?" Karen whispered, her voice cracking. Emma didn't speak. She only stepped forward, walking slowly, deliberately toward Caleb. Karen's breath caught in her throat as she watched Emma step forward. Her daughter was here, standing in front of them. But she wasn't the same girl Karen remembered. The sparkle in her eyes, the warmth, the light was gone. In its place was a cold, hard emptiness. Emma's face was blank, like a mask, and her posture was stiff and controlled, as though she were a different person altogether. "Emma, please, baby, it's me." "It's Mom," Karen whispered, her voice trembling. She took a step toward her daughter, her heart aching. This wasn't her daughter. It couldn't be. Not with that look in her eyes. Emma didn't respond, didn't even blink. She just kept walking toward Caleb, her steps slow but confident. Karen's throat tightened with panic, and she took another step, this time calling out louder, desperate. "Emma, please. I know you're in there. You don't have to do this. You don't have to listen to him." Caleb watched the exchange between mother and daughter with cold amusement. He stood back, his arms crossed, as if this was all part of the show. "You see, Karen," he said, his voice calm, almost clinical. "Emma made a choice. She understood what I was offering. She understood that I was offering her the world, not some fantasy. And now she's with us. She's stronger than you'll ever be. And she'll never go back to being the girl you once knew." Karen's chest tightened painfully. "No, I don't believe you. Emma, please look at me. I'm your mother. I've always been here for you. This man, he doesn't care about you. He's been using you." Emma's face remained stoic, but for the first time there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Something faint, something Karen recognized. A shadow of the daughter she once knew. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by the cold detachment that had taken its place. Caleb stepped forward then, breaking the silence. "This is pointless. You'll never get through to her. She's already made her decision, and there's nothing you can do to change that. It's too late for you to try and fix things." Karen felt a deep, gnawing pain in her chest. Was it too late? Was Emma truly lost? Had she been so caught up in this web of Caleb's control that she couldn't find her way back? Before Karen could respond, Emma moved again, this time standing beside Caleb. She looked down at her feet, her hands clenched at her sides, her jaw tight. Karen's stomach twisted as she looked at her daughter. Emma wasn't just physically different. She was emotionally distant. Something inside her had changed, and Karen wasn't sure she could reach her anymore. "Emma," Karen tried again, her voice shaking with emotion. "I know you're still in there. You're stronger than this. You're not like him. You can't be." Emma finally lifted her gaze, locking eyes with her mother for the first time. For the briefest moment, Karen saw something flicker. Recognition, a memory, perhaps. And then it was gone, replaced by a hardness that nearly broke Karen's heart. Emma spoke, but her voice was empty, as though she had rehearsed the words 1,000 times. "I'm not who I was before. And neither are you, Mom. You're not my world anymore. I've found something better." The words hit Karen like a physical blow. She wanted to scream, to grab Emma, to shake her and force her to understand. But deep down she knew it wasn't that simple. Emma had chosen this. She had chosen Caleb. And whatever he had promised her, whatever had been done to her, had taken away the daughter Karen had known. Caleb stepped in between them, his eyes dark with satisfaction. "You see? She understands, Karen. She's accepted what I've given her. And now she's mine. She'll never go back to being the girl you raised." Mark stepped forward, a look of utter disbelief on his face. "You did this to her," he said, his voice low with anger. "You poisoned her. You manipulated her mind. This isn't her choice. It's your control over her. She doesn't even know what she's saying." Caleb raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. "You think she doesn't know? You think Emma doesn't understand what she's doing? She's just as aware as any of us. The difference is, she's not afraid to embrace it. You don't know the truth, Mark. You never will." Karen looked back at her daughter, her heart breaking with each passing second. "Emma, please. Come back to us. Come back to me. You don't have to be a part of this. You don't have to do this to yourself." For a moment, Karen could have sworn she saw Emma's eyes soften, a flicker of emotion breaking through the cold facade. But then, just as quickly, her expression hardened again, and she turned away from her mother, walking back to Caleb's side. Karen's throat constricted, the weight of those actions crushing her. She was losing her daughter, losing her to someone like Caleb. A part of her was convinced that this was it, that she would never get Emma back. But then, as if to shatter that thought, Thomas spoke, his voice firm, cutting through the painful silence. "This isn't over." All eyes turned to him as he took a step forward, his gaze focused on Caleb. "You think you've won, but you're wrong. We're not leaving here without Emma. And we're not leaving here until we end this. You're not untouchable." Caleb's eyes flickered, just for a second, as if considering Thomas's words. But then his smile returned, just as wicked as before. "You want to play it that way?" He looked at his two men who had been standing still behind them this entire time and nodded. Before anyone could react, the two men lunged forward, grabbing Karen and Mark by the arms, yanking them backward. Karen struggled, trying to break free, but one of them tightened his grip, pulling her away from Emma. "Let her go," Mark shouted, struggling against the grip of the man holding him. Emma, standing beside Caleb, didn't move. She just watched, her face expressionless. It was as though her mother and father were just distant figures, irrelevant to whatever new life she had chosen for herself. "Enough," Caleb shouted, raising his hand to signal the men to stop. "Take them both to the back room. We'll deal with them later. As for you two, He gestured to Thomas and Emma. "I suggest you make your peace with the situation, because no one is leaving here the way they came in." Karen's heart shattered as the men dragged her away from her daughter, each step pulling her further from the one person she would do anything to protect. But even as the men pulled her into a small, dark room at the back of the warehouse, Karen's mind raced. There had to be something she could do. She couldn't give up on Emma. Not like this. As the door slammed shut behind her, she heard Caleb's voice in the distance, cold and calculating. "You'll see, Karen. When everything falls apart, you'll understand. You'll see what your daughter has become." And somewhere in the back of Karen's mind, a terrifying thought began to form. Could it be true? Was Emma really lost? But just before the door closed completely, Karen saw something that made her blood run cold. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Emma standing still, her back turned to Caleb. In that brief moment, their eyes met again. This time, Emma's expression was not the same cold indifference. There was something else, something that hinted at doubt. And in that moment, Karen knew something else too. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The small dark room was cold, its walls lined with dust and the faint scent of old machinery. Karen's mind was a storm of emotions, and she couldn't quite calm herself. She was disoriented, trapped, and powerless. Her heart ached, and the silence pressed down on her like a weight, suffocating her. She looked around the room, her eyes desperate for some sign of hope. But all she could see were the concrete walls, the lone light bulb overhead flickering sporadically, and the door that had just slammed shut behind her. Her breath quickened and her thoughts spiraled. Emma was right there, just beyond this door. But where was she? Was she still with Caleb? Was she really lost to him? Karen's mind raced, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to lose herself in despair now. She couldn't afford to let her daughter slip away. Mark was pacing, his face a storm of frustration and worry. He was a few feet away, trying to work through their situation as well. But Karen could see how badly this was affecting him too. He was struggling to process what had happened, what was happening, and how they could possibly get out of this mess. "We can't just sit here and do nothing," Mark said after a few moments of silence, his voice tight with anger. Karen nodded, her hands trembling as she wiped away a stray tear. "I know, but what can we do? They have us locked in here, Mark. And they have Emma. There's got to be a way out of here," he muttered, continuing his restless pacing. "We can't just wait for them to make their next move." Karen stood up, brushing the dust from her pants as she walked over to the door. She reached for the handle and twisted, but it was locked. Of course it was locked. They wouldn't make it that easy. "Don't waste your time," Mark said, stopping in his tracks. "We're not going anywhere unless they decide to move us." Karen's thoughts raced. What were they supposed to do now? How long would they stay here, locked away like animals? How could she save Emma if Caleb was always one step ahead of them? Then something clicked in her mind, a flash of realization. The look in Emma's eyes. For that split second, when their gazes met through the door, there had been a flicker of doubt. It wasn't much. It was barely noticeable, but Karen knew it was there. Emma was still in there somewhere. The question now was how to reach her. "Mark," Karen said, her voice sharper now, filled with new determination. "We have to get to her. I don't care what it takes." Mark stopped pacing and looked at her, his brow furrowed. "How? We're stuck in here. And Emma's with Caleb. What's the plan?" Karen shook her head, pressing her palm against the cold door. "We'll find a way. We can't just wait around. Caleb is dangerous, but Emma isn't lost. She can't be." Just then, they heard footsteps approaching the door. Karen froze, her heart leaping in her chest. Were they coming to get them? To drag them out and put them in some worse situation? The door opened abruptly, and one of Caleb's men stepped inside, his face as cold and expressionless as the rest. Karen's stomach tightened. This wasn't good. "Get up," the man ordered. His voice was flat, giving no room for resistance. Karen and Mark exchanged a glance. Without a word, Mark stood up first, his jaw clenched with determination. Karen followed suit, though her heart was racing. Was this it? Were they finally going to face Caleb head-on? The man led them down the narrow hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The warehouse was eerily quiet, too quiet. They passed darkened rooms and shadowy corridors, but Karen barely noticed. She was focused on one thing, Emma. As they reached the end of the hall, the man stopped in front of another door, this one much larger and reinforced. With a quick turn of the key, he unlocked it and swung it open. Inside, a dim light illuminated a wide-open room, and at the far end stood Caleb, leaning casually against a table. Emma was standing beside him, her back to them, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. Karen's breath caught in her throat. Emma hadn't turned around, hadn't even acknowledged their presence. She was standing so still, so quiet, as though she had forgotten everything that mattered to her. Caleb looked up at them, his smile slow and smug. "I see you've decided to join us," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I'm afraid you're a little late, though. Emma has already made her choice. She's no longer the person you thought she was." "Emma," Karen breathed, stepping forward, her voice desperate. "Please, look at me. You don't have to do this. You don't have to be part of this world." Emma remained silent, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Caleb stepped between them, blocking Karen's view of her daughter. "You're wasting your time," Caleb said smoothly, raising a hand to silence Karen. "Emma knows exactly what she's doing. She's not some scared little girl anymore. She's stronger. She's chosen her side." Karen's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't break down now. Not in front of Emma. "You're not stronger, Emma. You're just confused. He's using you. Can't you see that?" For a moment, Karen thought Emma might respond. Her shoulders twitched, her fingers curled as though she were fighting something inside herself. But then she straightened again, her expression hardening. "I've made my choice," Emma said, her voice distant, emotionless, "and I'm not going back." The words hit Karen like a physical blow. She felt her heart break in two. This wasn't the daughter she had raised. This wasn't the girl who had laughed with her, who had begged for ice cream after school, who had shared her hopes and dreams. Emma was gone. Caleb had taken her, twisted her into something else. "No," Karen whispered. She shook her head, her voice shaking. "You're my daughter. You're still in there. I know you are. Emma, please, I need you to fight this." But Emma didn't answer. She simply stood there, her eyes empty and cold, as Caleb grinned at Karen's futile attempt. "I'm afraid it's too late for her," Caleb said softly. He walked toward Karen, his face close now, his breath cold. "The Emma you knew is gone, and there's nothing you can do about it." Mark stepped forward, his voice steady but full of fury. "You're wrong, Caleb. You think you've broken her, but you haven't. You're making a huge mistake." Caleb paused, looking at Mark as if considering his words. "Am I?" He smirked. "Then show me what you can do. Let's see if you're really willing to fight for her." Before Mark could respond, Caleb raised his hand, signaling to the two men who had followed them into the room. They moved quickly, grabbing Mark and Karen by the arms and pulling them away from Emma. "No," Karen screamed, struggling against their grip. "Emma, don't listen to him, please." Emma didn't move. Her eyes were still fixed straight ahead, her face expressionless. The last shred of hope that had clung to Karen's heart began to fade, and a sinking feeling took its place. Could she really save Emma? Was it even possible anymore? Caleb stepped back, turning his attention to the two men holding Karen and Mark. "Take them back to their room," he ordered. "Let's see how long they can keep up this fight. It'll be over soon enough." Karen was dragged back down the hallway, her heart breaking with every step. As they reached the door to the small, dark room, she looked over her shoulder, her gaze searching for her daughter, her last hope. But Emma was still standing there, unmoving. Karen was locked back inside the room, the door slamming shut with a finality that made her stomach churn. She collapsed against the wall, her breath ragged. Mark sat beside her, his face grim. Neither of them spoke for a long while. They didn't need to. The truth was clear. They had to get Emma back, and fast. But how? The room was silent, save for the muffled sound of Karen's breathing and the occasional shuffle of Mark as he moved in his seat. The harsh light above them flickered occasionally, casting a dull, uncertain glow over the cold walls. Karen's mind was racing, trapped in a labyrinth of worry and confusion. She couldn't just sit here doing nothing. She couldn't allow Emma to slip further into Caleb's grip. But every plan, every idea she could think of, felt hopeless. Caleb had them locked away. Emma was distant, lost in a way that terrified her. And time was running out. Karen stood, pacing back and forth. "We can't wait any longer, Mark. We have to do something." Mark's voice was quiet, tired, but determined. "I know, but we can't just rush in there without a plan. Caleb's smart. If we go in blind, we're done. He's been controlling her for far too long." "I know," Karen said, frustration clawing at her chest. "But what's our choice? If we don't act now, we may never get Emma back." There was a long pause. Mark shifted on the cold concrete floor, his eyes glancing toward the small window high on the wall. It was too small to crawl through, too high to reach, but it was enough to remind them that they were trapped. "We need to find a way to get to Emma alone," Mark said finally, breaking the silence. "If we can talk to her without Caleb around, maybe she'll listen. She has to." Karen looked at him, hope flickering in her chest. "But how do we get to her? Caleb has all the power. He controls everything here." Mark exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "We don't know what kind of control he has over her. But I know one thing. Emma is not lost completely. I can see it in her. There's still something of the real her in there. We just need to reach her." Karen nodded, her mind whirling. "But how?" "I don't know yet," Mark said, standing up and pacing to the door. "But we'll find a way." They'd spent the next few hours in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Karen tried to come up with a plan, but every idea felt inadequate. Every time she thought she had a way out, she came up against the harsh reality of their situation. They were prisoners. Caleb held all the cards in Emma. Emma was no longer the girl they knew. The door suddenly creaked open, and Karen froze, her heart racing. One of Caleb's men stepped inside, a blank expression on his face. "You too," the man said, his voice flat. "Caleb wants to see you." Karen's stomach churned. She exchanged a glance with Mark, who gave a small nod. There was no choice now. They had to face Caleb. They had to do something, or they'd be stuck in this room forever. The man led them down the dark hallway again, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The tension was thick, and Karen felt a knot tighten in her chest with each passing step. They reached the large reinforced door, and the man knocked twice before pushing it open. Inside, Caleb was waiting, his usual smug grin plastered on his face. Emma stood beside him, her eyes downcast, her posture stiff. Karen's heart sank when she saw her daughter again, standing like a stranger. "Ah, Karen, Mark," Caleb said smoothly, his voice mocking. "I'm glad you could join us. I was just thinking it's time we had a little chat. You've been in that room long enough." Karen clenched her fists, fighting the urge to scream. "What have you done to her?" She spat, her voice shaking with rage. Caleb's smile never faltered. "What I've done to her? I've given her a choice, a chance to be something greater than the small life you gave her. She's no longer bound by your weakness. She's finally free." "Free?" Mark muttered, his voice tight with disgust. "She's not free. You've brainwashed her. You've turned her into someone else." Emma didn't look up. She stood quietly, her arms folded, her gaze distant. Karen's heart broke again. She couldn't reach her. She couldn't even get her to look at her. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Brainwashed? I prefer the term awakened. Emma has come into her own, something neither of you could ever provide for her. And now she belongs to something bigger." Karen took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Emma," she said softly, her voice full of desperation. "Look at me, honey. Please don't let him control you. You're stronger than this. I know you're still in there. I can feel it. You're my daughter." Emma remained motionless, her eyes still averted. It was like speaking to a stone wall. The longer Karen watched her, the more hopeless it seemed. But then, just as she was about to give up, Emma's shoulders twitched. It was small, but it was something. "Emma, please," Karen continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I don't know what he's told you, but you don't have to stay with him. You can come back. You can be you again." Caleb stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Enough of this. I'm not going to let you ruin what I've built here. Emma has made her decision. She's mine, and there's nothing you can do to change that." Karen stepped closer, her voice breaking. "Emma, please. I'm your mother. I love you." For the briefest moment, there was a flicker in Emma's eyes. A flash of recognition of emotion, something that resembled the girl Karen used to know. But before she could say anything more, Caleb's hand shot out, gripping Emma's arm tightly. "Don't listen to her." Caleb snapped, his voice suddenly harsh. "You're not a child anymore. You belong to me now." Emma's face hardened again, her expression slipping back into the cold, emotionless mask she had worn for so long. Karen's heart dropped. "Emma," Karen whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "Please come back. I can't lose you." But Emma didn't respond. Instead, she turned her head away from her mother, looking directly at Caleb. "I'm not going back," Emma said quietly, her voice almost unrecognizable. "This is who I am now." It felt like the final blow. Karen's legs nearly gave out beneath her, her hands gripping the edge of the table for support. Mark, however, was not ready to give up. His anger flared and he took a step toward Caleb. "You think you can just control her like this? You're wrong. She's not yours to own. She's our daughter, and we're not leaving here without her." Caleb chuckled darkly, the sound of it sending a chill down Karen's spine. "You're welcome to try, but I don't think you'll get very far." Before Karen could protest, Caleb snapped his fingers. Two of his men moved swiftly, grabbing Mark by the arms and dragging him backward. "Stop!" Karen shouted, her voice desperate. "Don't hurt him." But Caleb only laughed. "There's nothing you can do. I've already won." Karen turned to Emma, her last hope dwindling. She had to do something, anything, to break through to her daughter. But she had no idea what that something was anymore. Was Emma truly gone? And if she was, could they ever get her back? Karen stood frozen, her heart shattering as she watched Mark being dragged away by Caleb's men. Her breath caught in her throat as a cold realization began to settle in. She couldn't lose him too. But in that moment, something inside her snapped. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't just stand there and let Caleb win, let Emma slip further away. "Emma," she cried out again, her voice trembling with desperation. "You are not lost. I know you're still in there." But Emma, once again, didn't move. Her eyes were cast down, her arms crossed, a wall of indifference and coldness between her and her mother. It was like talking to a stranger. Karen's thoughts spun wildly, searching for any glimmer of hope, anything that could reach her daughter, any memory she could use, any thread of their old bond she could pull on to bring her back. Then suddenly a thought hit her. A small, almost forgotten memory surfaced. Emma had always been the most stubborn child, but also the most loyal. She hated seeing people hurt, especially people she loved. There had to be something left in her, a part of her that remembered the love they had shared. Karen took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice steadying as she spoke, despite the panic that churned inside her. "You remember the camping trip, don't you? The one we took up to Pine Creek when you were 10? Emma's face remained blank, but Karen saw her jaw tighten ever so slightly. That was it. Emma hadn't turned off completely. "We went hiking up that hill," Karen continued, her voice gentle but firm. "You were scared of the dark, but you stayed up with me, remember? You stayed up to help me when I hurt my ankle. And you wouldn't leave my side until we got back to the camp. You said you would never leave me. Do you remember that, Emma?" Emma didn't speak, but Karen could see it. Just a flicker, a small change in her daughter's stance. Emma's eyes shifted, as if the memory was finally reaching her. "Emma, you're not this cold. You're not this person. I've always been here for you. I've always loved you. Karen's voice cracked with emotion as she took another step closer. Please, don't let him take you from me. For a moment, the room was filled with an uncomfortable silence. Caleb stood still, watching with a quiet smirk, clearly confident that Emma would remain under his control. But Karen refused to give up. She couldn't, she wouldn't. And then Emma moved. It was the smallest motion, just a subtle shift of her eyes toward Karen, but it was enough to make Karen's heart leap. Emma's lips parted, and for a split second, Karen saw something soft, something familiar. Mom, Emma whispered, barely audible, but Karen heard it, and her heart surged. Before Karen could take another step, Caleb's voice interrupted, dark and threatening. You think you've won? You think a few memories will bring her back? She's made her choice. Karen's pulse raced, but she stayed focused on Emma. Emma, please, she whispered urgently. This is not who you are. You don't have to do this. Come back to me. Emma looked at her, her face still unreadable. But Karen saw it. The conflict in her eyes. Emma wasn't entirely lost. There was still a chance. I don't want this. Emma's voice broke, barely above a whisper, but it was there. It was a crack in the armor Caleb had built around her. Caleb's eyes darkened with anger. He stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. Enough. She's mine and you. But Emma interrupted him. No, she's right. I'm not what you made me. The words were like a knife to Caleb's chest, and for the first time, Karen saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Emma was fighting him. Emma, no. Caleb shouted, lunging toward her. Before anyone could react, Emma took a step back, her face resolute. I'm not yours anymore, she said, her voice gaining strength. I'm my own person. I'm going back to my mom. Karen couldn't believe her ears. It felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Could it be? Had Emma truly broken free? In a sudden movement, Emma grabbed Caleb's wrist, breaking his grip. Caleb stumbled back, furious. He wasn't used to losing control, least of all to his own creation. No, he hissed, his face twisted in rage. You're making a mistake, Emma. You'll regret this. But Emma stood her ground, her eyes never leaving him. I'm not going back to you. I'm going home. Karen couldn't stop the tears that filled her eyes. She rushed forward, her arms wide. Emma, honey, she cried, her voice thick with emotion. Emma looked at her, and in that moment it was like the entire world fell away. She was her daughter again, the girl Karen had raised, the girl she had always loved. The coldness was gone, replaced by the warmth and love that had always been there. Emma rushed into her arms, holding her tightly, as if she, too, were afraid to let go. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't know. I was so scared. Karen hugged her back, her heart aching with relief. You're safe now. You're with me. You're home. Caleb, in rage, moved forward again, but Mark stepped into his path. You're done, Caleb. You can't control her anymore. Get out of my way, Caleb snapped, but Mark didn't budge. You've lost, Caleb, Mark said, his voice steady. This ends now. Caleb's eyes darted around the room, but he knew the fight was over. He was losing his grip. Slowly he turned, his expression dark and filled with hate. This isn't the last time you'll see me, he muttered before storming out of the room. Karen and Emma stood there, holding each other tightly, tears flowing freely. It wasn't over yet. There would still be challenges ahead, but for now they had won. They had taken Emma back. We'll get through this, I promise, Karen whispered, brushing Emma's hair back from her face. You're safe now. Emma nodded, burying her face in her mother's shoulder, finally letting go of the fear and pain that had plagued her for so long. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Karen felt like she could breathe again. They were going to be okay.